Thank you, everyone, for attending. My name is Justin Dyer. I'm the director of the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy. Estimating crowd sizes is not our strength. We're always trying to match the room with the audience, and we don't always get it exactly right, but we're delighted to see so many of you out tonight for an important conversation. We have partnered together tonight with the Truman School of Public Affairs and the Reynolds Journalism Institute to have an important conversation about civil discourse in an uncivil age. The program itself is part of a larger program called Democracy and the Informed Citizen Initiative, and we got involved in that project through our partnership and relationship with the Missouri Humanities Council, and it's a larger program funded by the Mellon Foundation. And the initiative seeks to deepen the public's knowledge and appreciation of the vital connections between democracy, the humanities, journalism, and an informed citizenry. And so we thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for their generous support and the Pulitzer Prizes and Missouri Humanities Council for their partnership in this endeavor. And you might have noticed, some of you who got an actual seat, there are some surveys floating around on top of your desk there. And it's a little survey just that we do for the Mellon Foundation to provide them feedback, something that they requested from us. So if you happen to have a pen or a pencil and you're able to fill that out, that could be helpful for us, and you can just leave it where you found it, and we'll collect those at the end of the night. The plan for tonight is to do a talk, and then to have the talk immediately followed by a panel discussion. The talk is called Civil Discourse in an Uncivil Age, and our guest is Alexander Heffner, and I'll give him a proper introduction in a second. Immediately after his talk, we will then sit down for a panel discussion, and the panel discussion came together. It wasn't originally planned to be a double feature, but it came together because the Truman School of Public Affairs had been having some conversations last fall about the basic concept of freedom of speech, of civil discourse, particularly as it related to protests of Civil War monuments and the violence that we saw in Charlottesville last year. And it was an important conversation. It's one that we wanted to have. And so when we knew that we were going to do this event, we thought it made sense to pair those things together. I'll be one of the panelists, and joining me on the panel will be Krista Dirk-Seide from the History Department and the Kinder Institute, Devin Fergus from the History Department and the Department of Black Studies, and Berkley Hudson from the Journalism School. Moderating the panel will be Stephanie Shona, the chair of the Black Studies Department here. And so we will be reflecting on, responding to some of the comments that you hear tonight from Alexander Heffner. Alexander Heffner is the host of The Open Mind on PBS. He's covered American politics, civic life, and millennials since the 2008 presidential campaign, and his work has been profiled in the Washington Post, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Christian Science Monitor, Variety, Medium, NBC News, MSNBC, C-SPAN, NPR, CNN, BBC, ABC, and on and on. It's actually, we should come up with a list of where your work has not been featured, and we give you a shorter list. His writings appeared in Time, USA Today, Daily Beast, Reuters, Real Clear Politics, and on and on. He is the co-author of a documentary, History of the United States, out this year, a new edition out this year from Penguin, and so he's been out promoting that. He actually did, as a kind of side note, did that as a new edition on a book that his grandfather originally started and has been now in its 6th edition, or close to?
This will be the
10th edition, so now in its 10th edition. And so we're delighted to have Alexander with us tonight to talk about an important theme, important for us at the university, the Kinder Institute, the Truman School, for the Reynolds Journalism Institute. And so please join me in welcoming Alexander Heffner.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's a privilege to be with you, Justin, and your team at the Kinder Institute. You're engaged in some really important work, and it stands out as you describe yourselves, an inter-ideological project to help us advance our democracy. So congratulations on the important work you're doing here. And to all of you who are in attendance, I appreciate your time tonight. The topic is one I've been speaking about frequently on college campuses, from U.S. campuses to Copenhagen, Sydney. There seems to be a concern about the incivility in the air right now. I want you to reflect for a moment on the 2008 presidential campaign. For some of you in the audience, that might mean a Wikipedia page. For some of you, that might mean C-SPAN convention speeches. For others, it might have meant being in attendance at the RNC or DNC, or having an intimate memory of what that campaign was like. For me, it was the beginning of a career in journalism that would span now going on a decade. And classmates, peers, fellow student journalists, and I started a publication called Scoop 08. And the mission of Scoop 08 was for young people who were in high school, college, grad school, but who represent that millennial cohort to report on the campaign, to comment on youth-related stories connected to public policy on which the candidates were deliberating. And that was an up-close and personal guide as someone who was editing submissions from students around the country to a process of vetting, rigorous analysis, and actually student journalism that was competing with the likes of UPI and CNN and other organizations that we later partnered with. But I want to jog your memory because the 08 campaign cycle was a moment, I think, of civility in the way that the candidates conducted themselves, in the way that many of the journalists who were engaged in reporting conducted themselves, in the way that even the pundits that you might see on television conducted themselves. And there's one particular standout moment, and that was when then and still now Senator John McCain was approached in a town hall style forum, and there was a member of the audience who said, in a slightly questioning manner, but it was still stated as fact, Barack Obama is a Muslim. Barack Obama is a terrorist. And he very immediately took the microphone and almost verbatim said to her, "That's wrong, ma'am. Senator Obama is an honorable family man with whom I just disagree on a great deal of issues." And he repeated that, I think, in more than one town hall meeting, and you can find on C-SPAN or YouTube those decisive moments when we all remember that there were emails that circulated that were attempting to give legitimacy to the same kind of conspiracy feeding cycle that Donald Trump later revved up. For those of us who lived with email accounts during the 07 and 08 campaign, Barack Obama's opponents used conspiracy and innuendo to suggest and question his heritage then. But we had two grown men. They could have been grown women, but they were grown men, adults, mature, civil human beings. So I want you to reflect on an era of American politics not so long ago when we comported ourselves with civility and dignity. Alas, that's not today, in the form of our office holders, in the form of our chief executive, in the form of journalists and prognosticators and pundits who appear on a highly polarized cable news culture. But what I feel that and have reported on since 2008 is a high velocity moving vicious cycle of incivility. And I will delve into that incivility through the lens of a journalist who's deeply concerned about the culture of disinformation and misinformation that is running without pause in the digital sphere. I will elaborate on that momentarily. But I want to identify what I find from my own interviews and engagement with politicians, practitioners, and academics to be the sources of the incivility today. And we can later have a dialogue, and I hope the panel might assess what the chickens and eggs are in the relationship between the sources and the actual incivility itself. But to me, the incivilities that govern this vicious cycle, ensnare us in an uncivil culture today, are an incivility of bigotry. I think that is the start of a three-pronged monster here. The incivility of bigotry is not a racialized or ethnic bigotry alone. It's an ideological bigotry too. It's a geographic bigotry. It's a bigotry in all of its guises. And that bigotry precludes us from having open discourse. That bigotry is demonstrated in the form of ideological warfare on cable news. It's demonstrated in the form of the inability of legislators from red states to talk to legislators from blue states. And that has really handicapped the driving force of discourse, what distinguishes us from non-human beings. And that is our ability to reason and rationalize, and then ultimately to discuss and to deliberate and to forge consensus and compromise, which I know the Kinder Institute is largely responsible, shepherding a vision of civility through those tenets that are most important to advancing democracy and diversity of opinion in that democracy. So if you have incivility of bigotry, then I think you ultimately arrive at an incivility of obstructionism. And we've seen in recent years over healthcare and tax legislation that the result has been one party attempting to jam down legislation. The obstructionism is, on a federal level, far more severe than in most states, but states also have suffered from the same kind of obstruction, because if you have an incivility of bigotry and you can't communicate with someone who disagrees with you on one or more issues, then you're left in this place of obstruction. We saw this with the nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court, a nomination that failed to receive even a hearing, let alone an up or down vote from Majority Leader McConnell. That is one of several examples. You can go back to the initial Affordable Care Act, which did not receive Republican votes. You can go to the attempted recall or repeal of that legislation. You can go to the tax legislation. Now, because we recognize that that obstruction is there, and it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room, it's incumbent upon us to think creatively, imaginatively about how to overcome what is obstruction, and I'll say, as a final prong of incivility, dysfunction. But I think that you saw during the most recent legislative battles the incapacity to even get to the table with legitimate substantive hearings on tax reform. There was an abdication of responsibility on the part of our legislators to have a deliberative process, because there was no conviction in what that process would look like. There was no in-depth testimony, investigation, or due diligence, and that was the case both with the scuttled healthcare and ultimately the passage of the tax reform. Dysfunction is what I think we find ourselves in most frequently with a president who thrives on chaos and being someone who actually embraces a government that appears to be struck with pandemonium, 100%. The dysfunction is the way that Americans view their government in survey after survey. They view the United States Congress and institutions of government with disregard or disrespect, and they don't believe that they're comporting themselves in a way that they ought to. And therefore, we've seen now a president and a Congress with record low approval, and that has been the case going on over a decade. So it's really these aspects, these elements of incivility that I think ensnare the political process, the bigotry, the obstructionism, the dysfunction. And each one is culpable in a different way, and you can describe examples of how together they are furthering the division and entrenchment of ideologies instead of the openness to discussion, deliberation. I speak from my own experience as the host of a program that's designed to have a constructive model of discourse. And I think as we look towards the panel, that it's incumbent upon each and every one of us to think about how we can employ speech constructively, not destructively, and understanding that the First Amendment does not give us license to engage in threatening speech, does not condone in any way counterproductive speech, and it's really our responsibility to promote a culture of responsible stewardship of the airwaves, which is what we try to do each week by inviting guests on the program who are thoughtful, who are open-minded, to use the name of the program, The Open Mind, and who are deeply committed to a pro-social vision of democracy. And here's where I'm going to transition now to what I find to be the most antisocial, uncivil aspects of contemporary American life, specifically our president and the antisocial media complex that has monetized misinformation, disinformation, and I like to say very plainly fraud. The reality of the current age is that a growing number of Americans and citizens of the world rely on platforms that have been utterly irresponsible in the dissemination of propaganda. An anti-social media is really performing those three functions of bigotry, obstructionism, and dysfunction. And they're doing it as publicly traded companies with shareholders who are not being held responsible for the reality of the anti-social media experience today, which is that these companies have profited, and investigation after investigation demonstrates that they profited off of what is proven now to be falsehoods, conspiracies. In the case of Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, they actually verified what we thought to be the veracity and what viewers and listeners thought to be the veracity of a website like InfoWars. They actually gave InfoWars a check mark. We have a crisis when it comes to the absence of moral leadership and specifically the need for classification and moderation in social media that have become such a dominant thread of the information culture. Now, we've seen, as the journalists here can testify to, a rapid diminishing of the profit going to the labor of journalistic endeavor. To put it bluntly, these companies further exacerbated the problem by incentivizing people to go for clickbait, go for viral, even if it's not true, and even if it's determined to be untrue over time. So you're witnessing in real time over the last 48 hours a scandal that's one of a series of scandals that I've talked about on The Open Mind for the last 2 years with scholars who've been very much concerned about the formation of those silos, information bubbles, and the dissemination of hate, harassment, and disinformation online. Those are uncivil circumstances of our contemporary life, our media, and our discourse. And some of us have deliberately withdrawn from those spaces because we feel that they're inconsistent with our values, or they do not represent truly the experience that we have as Americans. And some of us have done that, but the vast majority of Americans are still engaged, especially a new generation, with these platforms. So I'm left contemplating what is the answer in terms of injecting or importing a value system of civility into the current media apparatus. And it's a huge challenge, of course, but I think we have to start by recognizing what the underpinnings are of a civil culture or civil society. And to me, they are literacy and empathy. Those, to me, they're the foundation of any kind of media experience that we want. When a journalist interviews us, whether it's a man or woman on the street interview, whether it's in one of your classes or even on television as you're watching, you want to believe that the journalist and the source are engaged in an honest deliberation that is going to elicit information. That requires a commitment to truth and honesty and a connectedness to human beings, which we've seemed to lost in the era of big anti-social media. So there are micro and macro attempts to resolve the current crisis. As I said before, if we all went out and bought a share of these companies, we would be the ones in part responsible for, or could be the ones responsible for steering the companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter in the right direction. Because there is investment in an ownership in a publicly traded company that does require consultation. Now that is an abstract notion, but if we all really went out and bought a share of these companies, even one share, and started a change.org or another kind of petition to demonstrate that we own this and that we're going to play by a set of rules and norms that we think foster democracy and civil discussion, then it would be incredibly meaningful. That is at the kind of macro level. But there are micro level steps, one of which is an experiment on some news websites to quiz you before you comment. So there are a couple of European websites that have experimented with in the comment section. In order to comment or in order to participate in the story, you have to take a very brief rudimentary quiz to show that you actually read the story. Now, many websites and news organizations have just withdrawn entirely from the process of vetting or moderating. Some of them have staff, some of which is outsourced, some of which is in-house, dedicated to the oversight of comments and interactivity and participation. But the central problem is we have to discriminate once again between what is news and information and what is fanciful, conspiracy, artistic endeavor. And there's no reason to my mind that YouTube can't, for instance, set up a very clear entry point to their website where you know where verified information is, and to ban offenders of a policy that prohibits hate, prohibits disinformation, misinformation, and that will punish multiple offenders by banning their accounts. Now, I think that classification and moderation are what is really necessary to fulfilling the promise of an open society on the web. Otherwise, to use the original founding mandate of a website like Facebook, what are you opening society to? These can't be amoral devices anymore if we want to strive for a civil society that values certain things. And I think we're all waking up to that reality, some of us more gradually than others. So I demonstrated kind of an example of a micro step that newspaper or websites can take to try to facilitate discourse that is pro-social rather than anti-social. I've also talked, again, in a big picture, macro sense of what shareholders could do and ultimately what these websites could do to fix algorithms that are designed to produce feedback loops of conspiracy. Because conspiracy is often more exciting and exhilarating for a viewer and will get more likes, clicks, and views than something that's not. and YouTube, whether it's YouTube Kids or the main website, continue to feed into algorithms that are designed, even if you watch something legitimate that is verified, to feed you something that is illegitimate and unverified. They're doing that because it attends to and achieves a furtherance of their bottom line, purely out of the desire to feed shareholders who are unconcerned about the social ramifications of their products, which really ought to be public services. The best example of an open website, a platform where any of us could contribute, just as anyone can post something to YouTube, that functions to further pro-social knowledge is Wikipedia. It is one of the last surviving examples of an open source that has a dedicated, a devout following and user base of contributors who are not banned according to IP address, who are free to post as they see fit, but there is a demand. And the demand is from the Wikipedia guidelines that you provide sources and evidence. And if YouTube is becoming the Encyclopedia Britannica, then that is a frightening proposition. And so you may have read recently, just in the last few days, that YouTube surprised Wikipedia by saying that they were going to insert facts from Wikipedia entries into conspiracy videos to try to link people to the accurate information, instead of doing what they should be doing, which is designing or helping Wikipedia design an audio-visual foundation to build on its amazing resource of entries. And instead, what they're doing has the potential of corrupting the Wikipedia system if you're merely feeding people what Wikipedia does through conspiracy videos. And moreover, the problem is that the conspiracy videos are there and that they're rampant, and that in many instances during the 2016 campaign and before that, they were being monetized. So now I want to shift from the digital space to kind of the human space. We've talked about the literacy, which I think is most connected to the digital humanities, and now I want to talk about the more traditional human touch or approach in how we can perhaps revive a culture of civility. These are, depending upon their execution, micro or macro. One example is I was based at Franklin Pierce College in New Hampshire in the run-up to the New Hampshire primary in 2016. And New Hampshire PBS invited myself and the director of the Marlin Fitzwater Center for Communications to brainstorm a solution to a major problem, which was everyone was dispatched to New Hampshire to cover a New Hampshire primary, but they were covering it from the national perspective, and they weren't concerned with the genuine livelihoods of the New Hampshire voters. And the other problem is that the debates that began already during the cycle were personality contests on steroids. They were not interested in facilitating an honest and open and substantive exchange of ideas, and certainly did not care about any specific issues of concern to New Hampshire voters. And we decided we were going to attempt something called primary dialogue, based on something that PBS and Fred Friendly's widow, Ruth Friendly, invented some years ago, called the Fred Friendly Seminar. The idea was to have a debate stage or a Socratic table around which there could be candidates from both parties. And we began to invite a number of candidates in what we thought would be a very focused exchange that discussed real-world issues to New Hampshire voters, and that was dedicated to an inter-ideological premise, and that is that we can learn from each other. We can learn from each other as candidates from two different parties. Up until this point, of course, in the cycle, you had debates that were tailored to the extremes on each ideological spectrum, to the base of the party, and also issues that were not of concern to the early voters in the Iowa caucus or New Hampshire primary or later contests. So we said, why don't we do this? We invited several candidates. including prominent ones who agreed to do this. You may be surprised they agreed to do this. Well, you have to remember that Donald Trump was the beneficiary of $1 trillion in free media and was really sucking all the air out of the campaign. In the celebrity death match that has been the Access Hollywood of our politics, had consumed every moment. And so there were candidates like Bernie Sanders and Jeb Bush who were interested in our idea. Ultimately, a couple of them agreed to participate. Only later, as we were organizing the event, to receive notices from the RNC and DNC, respectively, that they would be barred from entering the sanctioned party events if they merely stood around their fellow countrymen or sat around a table with candidates who represented other parties. And the reality of that experience is it's truly emblematic of a culture in D.C. that is toxic partisanship, the incivility of bigotry, obstruction, dysfunction, epitomized in the failure to have an exchange around the campaign and election to the most important office, at least on the federal level of our land. And it's truly a damning idea and notion that that could not be facilitated. I'll close with this thought and proposition to any of you who are in the journalism program here. And I'm speaking to the Post Millennials, whose consciousness is alive, and we see that in the students in Florida, and we see that all across our screen now in the necessary and extraordinary civic participation in response to the epidemic of gun violence in this country. We see the need for an entertainment-obsessed American media culture to have a different motivating factor or impetus driving what they do. In other words, we need a media that is activist in encouraging public policy to be focused on our lives and our livelihoods as citizens and not distractions. What we see now governing our country are primarily, as we understand through the media, tweets. And as soon as that 140 characters or 280 characters enters our bloodstream, whether it's true or false, that becomes the news story. And unfortunately, the unlimited megaphone that Donald Trump was afforded during the campaign to spew what were conspiracy theories at times and outright falsehoods at other times continues because he's the president and we do report on what our office holders say. The trick here is that we need to amuse our democracy back to life, okay? To cite the old media critic, the esteemed media critic who I was so happy to hear one of your students, at least one of your students, was reading in English class, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. We need to inject a format or a kind of programming mentality that is fueled around the same needs of our culture, whether that's a reality TV or celebrity. And I'm not proposing that the person who opposes Donald Trump should be a celebrity or that his agenda should be opposed by celebrities. What I am proposing is that we need a kind of amazing race to legislative success and to success as a country. If we had a news director or news vice president at CNN or any of the networks that was committed to advancing sound public policy, they would wake up and say, okay, we want to pair a couple of our most interesting representatives and wake up in the morning with them, John McCain and his Washington Post and cup of coffee, and do a reality series that is two of our legislative icons or heroes committed to the prospect of the betterment of this union through bipartisan cooperation. And it may not sound sexy, but what is the alternative? I think it could be sexy. I think it could be highly gratifying and deeply patriotic. And I would encourage all of you young people and the non-young people in the room to think about how the Parkland students have been imaginative in awakening our civic pride, whether you agree or disagree with particular measures that any one of the students may propose. But the idea that that imagination is what we ought to be seeking from our journalistic cohort right now. And of course, do the due diligence in the investigative journalism and expose what has been proven already to be extreme corruption in this administration and a lack of accountability from the congressional office holders. But I do think that whoever imagines the present quagmire and the operating software of our society as tweets and reality TV and says we need to use this culture as it is today, and it's not changing, along with a pro-social media complex to further our objectives as citizens, well, then we're back in the game. Then we're committed to executing our ideals as media, as citizens, and as people who believe that we can together realize a more civil America, a more civil discourse, and a more civil society than we have today. With that, I want to thank you for being here today. I also just want to note that there's going to be a panel now, but I'm happy to answer questions later.
So the panelists will take a seat. I'm Stephanie Shona. I'm chair of the Department of Black Studies, and I have a joint appointment in Black Studies and the School of Music. So as an ethnomusicologist, I think about this through the lens of music quite often. And I always say that if people were to just take the music seriously, you would understand everything that has just been said. I can give you a playlist right now that would accompany Mr. Hefner's wonderful words. So let me just start by saying how proud I am of Mizzou for the work that we've done here in the last couple of years. We haven't only dealt with the last election, but we've also dealt with some real movements on this campus around civility, around run by students who wanted this university to kind of stand up and think about what does it mean to be civil for everybody. And I'm very, very proud that this campus has done, I think, an exceptional job of really taking the bull by the horns, not turning away from our history, but actually taking that, and I almost think that we could be a model for the rest of the country. But Mr. Hefner, when you get that reality show on, we will be watching, because I feel like that's what we've been doing in our classes for so many of us. I want to quickly brag on the class that I teach with the Kinder Institute. It's called Race and the American Story. A result of thinking about how do we get our students to really become better citizens of our campus and of our community. But I won't talk too much. I am here to keep these four experts on track. I've asked them each to spend just about 5 minutes, and I will be timing them. 5 minutes just responding to what they just heard, understanding that for us now, our job is to figure out how this how all of this translates to a campus setting. Again, let me introduce them, and then I'll let them go one at a time. So right here to my left is my colleague, Dr. Devin Fergus, who is a professor of history and Black Studies. He holds the endowed chair in the Department of Black Studies. His book that's coming out, I think it's out. Is it out yet?
In June.
In June. He works on race and capitalism, and his book is called Land of the Fee. Not Land of the Free, Land of the Fee. So that's coming out. So Devin will start, followed by Dr. Krista Dirkscheid, who is a professor in the Kinder Institute and the Department of History, who has several works, among them a book on Jefferson, which and race, which is something that our students in our Race and the American Story have been thinking about. Next to Dr. Dirkscheid is my friend and buddy, Dr. Berkley Hudson, who is a professor in the School of Journalism and has done a lot of work thinking about how race and racism have been captured in the Deep South and specifically in his own home state of Mississippi. And then finally, Dr. Justin Dyer, the director of the Kinder Institute, and a professor who has done a lot of work on the Constitution, on the concept of independence, and on slavery and anti-slavery. So please help me welcome them to the panel. So Devin, let's start with you.
Okay.
Responses. Please speak into the mic right there.
Okay.
Be comfortable.
All right.
Be at home. 5 minutes.
Sounds good. My plan is to yield back the balance of my time.
Okay.
So you should have plenty more than 5 minutes. So again, thank you so much, Mr. Hefner, for presenting to us today. I'm virtually on board with almost everything you sort of said. I'm a historian. You have two historians sitting next to each other. But I'm going to sort of talk about perhaps what I see as a potential. This is just a caveat. Again, the value of civility, especially for a multiracial liberal democracy, for the civic nationalist project known as the U.S. To borrow some phrase from Gary Gerstle, I think civility is critical and important. But it's also important too to recognize the possible, the unimaginable, unintended consequences of pitfalls for civility. Let me flash you back. May 1954, a Supreme Court case called the Brown decision, right?
Can you speak?
Okay, a little bit, okay, sounds good. A Supreme Court case called the Brown decision. And in that case, in the Brown decision, a unanimous decision by the Warren Court. The first Southern state to acknowledge, to state publicly that they were going to abide by the Brown decision was the city of Greensboro, North Carolina, in 1954. Again, unprompted, so this is a decision where we're a nation of laws, not of men, and we fully intend to abide by the Brown decision. It took Greensboro almost 20 years to desegregate its schools. Read a book called Civilities and Civil Rights by William Chafe, right? So civility is critical in a liberal democracy, but the caveat I would sort of suggest to add is it is also a tool used by those in power or influenced by the hegemon to maintain and then hold on to its power and equality. So the question becomes, what are the mechanisms used by the people who are claiming and arguing for their rights, right? Think about Martin Luther King. How many times he was arrested or incarcerated because he had, for quote, disturbing the peace, right? For violating the civil order of the South. And so civility is often a weapon of the weak, I think, and often used by populations who are often on the margins. And so so what are the mechanisms used by marginalized folk, I think, engaged, and are they engaged in addressing inequality through uncivil discourse? And so, again, I fully embrace the idea that civility is important, absolutely important in the classroom. But also, and again, this is, you talk about the chicken and the egg. I mean, and maybe this is just me in part being complicating the picture a little bit, making the picture messy, as academics and scholars do, is that some of my best classes have been also some of the most uncivil classes, in all honesty. I'll just say that. I used to teach at Columbia and at City College of New York. And some of the most provocative, interesting classes were when students were not afraid to challenge one another and to provoke one another. Now the question becomes, how do one hold the bounds and balances of those sort of academic intellectual spaces? But I also believe it's often critical to be uncomfortable to learn. And it's very hard to learn in a very comfortable space and environment. It's very hard to change in a very comfortable environment, right? I mean, that famous living black Republican, according to the current president, Frederick Douglass, once said that those who profess to want freedom without agitation, right, want the crops without the plowing the ground, want the rain without lightning and thunder, right? Want the ocean without the roar of the waters, right? That power demands nothing. I mean, that power demands concedes nothing without demand. And so, while I'm absolutely on board with Hefner's argument about civility, I also think it's vital and important to understand that civility has often been used to suppress historically marginalized populations. Look at, even on this campus, Lynn Mia Itagaki, her book on civil racism, talking about the civil racism that undergirds the 1992 LA rebellions and Rodney King rebellions, the ways in which civil racism was used to push back against social protests of marginalized people. And so I'm very much agree with what Mr. Hefner sort of said, but again, my concern is about how the unintended consequences that civility may often have, particularly when you talk about, and again, as someone who writes on capitalism and edits a book series on studies of capitalism, I very much appreciate the arguments for the ways in which shareholder activism might also be used to marginalize populations of people like black and brown folk who have 7, 8, or 9 cents of the wealth of the average white person.
All right.
And so I'll leave my remarks
Thank you,
here.
Darren.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, as Krista is taking over, I want you all to sort of think about, as to Devin's point, this idea that for as much kudos and honor that's being given to the Parkland students, rightfully so, the ways in which we thought about black students on our campuses just a couple of years ago, not in the same light. So thinking about how this idea of civility is used against people of color. Just wanted to put that out. Dr. Krista Dirkscheit.
Okay, thank you very much to my fellow panelists, the moderator, and also to Alex Hefner for that very thoughtful speech. For better or for worse, I am the second historian on this panel. And I came here to Mizzou about 6 months ago after having spent 20 years in Charlottesville working at Monticello and also teaching at UVA. So I'm going to come at this issue from a very historical angle. Of course, I laud this future that Alex and others have painted of a more civilized society based on common values. But I'd like to suggest today that a lot of the problems that we're seeing, the divisions that we're seeing in our society, are a result of a contest not only over what America is, but also over what America was. And I think that if we can finally see each other as one people, to invoke Jefferson's language in the first sentence of the Declaration, until we can finally recognize our common humanity here in America, I think we have to, paradoxically, to move forward, we need to move to look backward. We need to recover a collective past in order to see ourselves as a single people. And so what I'd like to suggest is that in order to attain this kind of civil society that Alex Hefner has articulated for us, we need more history. We need to look backward more in order to look forward. And I think part of that, and the premise of this panel originally was to talk about memorials. I think we need to see more of our contested history in the landscape, not just in museums, not just in classrooms, in our landscape. And the thing, and I think you brought this up briefly, is that history is not something that makes us feel good. And I try to emphasize this to my students. History makes us uncomfortable, okay? And it should. Okay, because there are a lot of disturbing things that are part of our national history and any nation's history, really. But I think that we need to see more of that history, that problematic history in the landscape. And of course, this debate has come to a head over the debates over the Confederate memorials, which of course are not history, they're memory, right? Those memorials were erected between the 1890s and 1920s as part of the lost cause mythology of the Civil War and as part of the imposition of a Jim Crow institutionalized racism in this country. I don't think we should take those memorials down. I think we need to put more memorials up that engage with other aspects of how the Civil War and other uncomfortable aspects of American history have been interpreted. There is, for example, the emancipationist memory stream of the Civil War. There is the reconciliation interpretation of the Civil War. There is the Union understanding of the Civil War, the fact that the Civil War was fought to put this nation back together. In other words, I think we need to talk more about not just what our history was, but how we remember that history and how those memories of what we were are still polarizing us today. And so I'd like to just make a bid for a more open, civil discussion in places like this. I mean, this forum is really unbelievable. We have students, we have faculty members, we have members of the community coming here to talk about an uncomfortable subject. Right? This is not a nice subject to talk about, is the divisiveness of our current political and social climate. But I think we need more forums like this, and I think we need to utilize public spaces better in order to engage with who we are, in order to move forward in a more united and less divisive front. Thank you.
Thank you. He always does this. He usually comes with a stack of books, but he does have 5 minutes, so. So as he's plugging in, Krista, I'd love for you to come back to the idea of the Thomas Jefferson Memorial on our campus, which was not put up in 1896. It was put up in the 2000s. So
He was
how do you
wearing
think
Mardi
about
Gras
that?
beads the other day.
Sorry?
He was wearing Mardi Gras beads the other day.
Thank you. My name is Berkley Hudson. I'm from the journalism school. I just want to give a visual kind of trigger. And I'm sure many in your mind's eye, you've seen a lot of things as Alexander Hefner talked and as the other panelists talked. So I'm going to give us just a little visual tour of some things that are going on and have been going on that connect with ideas that our panelists have already discussed here. Just going back to John Milton, for those of you that know John Milton, and some of these ideas that I'm putting up here may seem quaint or naive, but I had the good fortune actually to have Fred Friendly as a teacher and Benno Schmidt in that when that whole idea was developed at Columbia University. And so we talked about these ideas about truth grappling, and I like this idea. And then there's the idea from Justice Brandeis that you may be familiar with, the idea, is more speech the answer as opposed to less speech? And what kind of speech is it? And who's doing the talking? So I grew up in Columbus, Mississippi, and here's a very complicated idea that I could spend my whole 5 minutes starting to unpack that connect with these ideas that have both just come up. So this is 1950, white women reenacting what happened in 1866 when down in the deep well of sorrow and forgiveness and reconciliation. These 4 white women came down about 10 blocks from my house where there was a cemetery before I was born, and they put white flowers on the graves of the Union soldiers that came from Shiloh and then the Confederate soldiers that came from Shiloh. And there's a debate whether or not Memorial Day really started here. There's a few other towns that claim it. But nonetheless, that happened in 1866. And then there was a poem that was published by a Yankee, a New Yorker, a judge, in the Atlantic Monthly. And I like the phrase, when they laurel the graves of the dead under the sodden dew, that they banished our anger forever. Well, not quite. And again, I think there's a complexity here, which the panelists have just brought up about how civility masquerades also. So, and that's what's really interesting. So in 1950, they're dressing up in hoop skirts, and they're saying, oh, look, see how good we were? Yet I grew up with that, along with Jesus Loves Me, and it made me start to think about, okay, how are you supposed to be? So you should be, reconciliation and deep listening should occur. Now here in Tupelo, the hometown of Elvis, they put up a marker here to the Federal and Union troops after the Battle of Tupelo. It's one of the few places that I've seen where this coexists, and then the other monument there, they're all on the same plot of land where the Battle of Tupelo was, and that was for the Confederates. Interesting. There are about 1,300, I think, Confederate monuments everywhere. I was just in Oxford on the town square with my friend who used to be the mayor there, and we were outside and we saw, not this statue, that's another statue at Ole Miss, but we were talking about, well, couldn't we just have more statues? And he said, maybe it's too late. I think maybe it's too late. I don't think it's too late because I'd like to see the 9 or 10 first African Americans who integrated here walking into Jesse Hall in statue form. That's my Mizzou Miracle dream. So, but here's this statue, and now here's the plaque down here, explanatory plaque that the sons of Confederate veterans protested and filed a lawsuit about. We don't have time to read all this. I encourage you to look it up and see what's said here. But it's incredible, and it references millions of people were freed as a result, and that the Civil War was not about states' rights, it was about slavery. So now here on the same campus where 2 people died in 1962 with the federal forced integration of Ole Miss, here's a statue to James Meredith that was erected. A noose was put around Meredith's head, and then here the protests, the students came out and say, that's not who we are. This is who we are. Everybody needs to go to Mississippi and see the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Everybody needs to go to Washington, D.C. and see the new Museum to African American History and Culture. In Mississippi now, there's a list of people documented lynchings in Mississippi. You won't believe this museum. $80 to $90 million was spent. I was just there 3 days after Trump was there. It's an incredible experience. It's owning our history, and it's very uncomfortable. And I'm dealing with lynchings in my own town and researching that, and it's very uncomfortable. But everybody also needs to go to the Equal Justice Initiative lynching memorial that'll be opening 1 month from about today in Montgomery, Alabama. Let's, how about this? Here's UNC, Sandra Bland. How about this, Berkeley? How about this, Berlin? How about this, Rodney King? About the time my oldest daughter was born. Can we all get along? How about this, Black Panther closing speech?
Okay, that's all right. That's all right. All right, Justin.
Thank you all for your patience with us tonight. I am in the political science department. I'm interested in political thought and constitutionalism, and so I'll direct some of my comments in that area. There are really 3 things that I took note of during the comments and that I might say a little bit about. The first was this question that Alexander asked, and it was, what makes us human? The second is what it means to be inter-ideological, this term that we've invented to try to describe what we're doing. And then the third gets us into the idea of free speech and the place of free speech in our society with a very short period of time, so I'll try to tackle those one by one. The first, what makes us human? If you go back to some of the ancient political philosophers, they noted very early on that there's something distinctive about human beings, and it's that we have the ability to speak. And with the ability to speak, we can indicate to each other not just what causes pleasure or pain, but what we think is just or unjust. And so we have a notion of justice, and we have a notion of the good, and a way to communicate that to each other. And that's unique about human beings. And with that, a couple of other things that are unique. We can blush. We feel shame. And we can joke with each other. And Alexander talked about trying to amuse our democracy back to life. There's an element of all three of those things that I think is important for us to keep in mind in terms of what it means to be human, what it means to interact with others. And those three aspects, being able to have a sense of justice and communicate to each other what's right and wrong, not simply what is in our interest or what causes pleasure and pain, being able to have a sense of humor and to be able to joke, and being able to sense shame that we've done something shameful, I think is important for us. And those things give rise to norms of civility. When we're exchanging reasons with each other, when we're engaging with each other about important topics, we have to first take each other seriously as human beings, as people who have a sense of justice, as people who are able to feel shame and to be shamed, as people who have a sense of humor and have a kind of levity in their engagements with each other. And those norms of civility, I think, are extremely important for us that we develop in order to have those interactions with each other and in order to communicate with people that we don't immediately agree with. And this gets into the idea of what it means to be inter-ideological. We have at the Kinder Institute a program that is, from the beginning, designed to be interdisciplinary. We've brought political theorists and political scientists and historians and others together to consider some important themes that we think about American constitutional democracy, our ideas that underpin this project, and our history. And in order to do that well, we have to be able to give and exchange reasons with each other. And we found, not really deliberately, but over time, that we happen to disagree with each other. And we have people from across the political spectrum voting for all sorts of different candidates and committed to all sorts of different ideas, and nonetheless engaged in a true common enterprise and talking with each other, giving reasons to each other. And all of that occurs within a broader framework of civility, and civility is in fact what makes that possible, in order to come to people that you disagree with, knowing that you have something to learn from them and that they have something to contribute to the conversation. So that's been really important from us from the beginning. We've tried to do events where we bring people together to have that conversation. I think it's sorely needed in our society. Now, transitioning from that, there are norms of civility that, at least as I see it, belong in civil society. That they are norms for how we interact with each other, but it's very, very difficult to enforce those norms with the law or with the arm of the law. And so it gets us into the question of free speech. And I'll give a qualified defense of what the Supreme Court has done on this. We have a unique constitutional tradition in our First Amendment. We give much greater protections to free speech than other countries do, even other constitutional democracies. And so it's a unique American tradition, but I think it flows partly from this underpinning idea that we should have a government that elicits the consent of the governed, and that we should be able to give and understand reasons for action. There's a principled case for free speech, and there's a prudential case. The principled case is that the search for the truth actually demands that error and truth be able to meet in this kind of way that Berkley had talked about, error and truth be able to meet openly and freely, and that truth will win out. And that becomes a kind of principled case for free speech. The prudential case, which I actually think is more persuasive, is that we don't know who will wield political power. And the suppression of any idea or the suppression of speech in any form is done as an exercise of political power. Those in political power decide what kind of speech is acceptable and what kind of speech is not. And we don't know when our friends are going to wield political power. And there's always the chance that the other team wields political power. And if it becomes the case that whoever is in power decides what ideas are acceptable or not, that becomes a very dangerous situation. And so the prudential arrangement that we have is that we will protect freedom of speech in a content-neutral kind of way. And so the Supreme Court has said you can have time, place, manner restrictions, you can have reasonable regulations. There are certain very limited classes and categories of stalking and harassment and face-to-face communications and things that we do protect people from. But the idea that we would suppress ideas as such is one that our constitutional tradition has moved away from. Now, my small criticism of the Supreme Court on this point is that they've done this ostensibly because they're moral relativists, or at least as you read their opinions. And so in one case, for example, one of the members of the Supreme Court said in his opinion that one man's vulgarity is another man's lyric. And there's this idea that who's to say what idea is true or not, and therefore will defend free speech. I actually don't think that's right. I think that we all sitting in this room and all in society think that there are some ideas that are compelling and persuasive and some ideas that are not. There are some ideas that are true and just, and there are some ideas that are not. And it's not that we're relativists on this, but rather that we see the prudence of this tradition and this prudence of protecting free speech. Now, it gets very, very difficult very, very quickly, and we've seen that in all the debates and discussions that we've had, but that's my limited defense of our free speech jurisprudence.
So I have a few questions, and then we'll open it up for a little bit. But both Krista and Justin, you both invoke this idea that we are all human, we are all one people, and so on. Yet, if we go back to Jefferson and the ways in which he thought about Black people as human beings, and I'm bringing this up because, as Alexander Hefner said, what will get us to the promised land is literacy and empathy, right? So if I may come back to that point, and I know Justin, so I know he didn't mean anything by it, but I don't blush, right? So even thinking carefully about the ways in which we have constructed what human beings are, who gets to define it, and understanding that the era that we're in now is an era where there's certain people in high places who have tried to dehumanize some members of the citizenry. So would you please respond to this idea of we are all one people, what makes us human, and then we can, I think, move forward.
Sure. I could start, I think, with the embarrassed, not blush. So I'll not do that again. So getting to the ideas, I think the way that I understand the relationship between ideas and practice is that we can evaluate the ideas. So some of the founders will articulate certain ideas, and we can evaluate those ideas, and we can see where practice was in contradiction to the ideas. And so certainly for the American founders, Thomas Jefferson is a great example of this. There are enormous contradictions in his own life and the way that he conducted his own affairs and some of the writings and things that he said. And then there are other places that I think the ideas actually are good. And so, for example, when Jefferson writes that all men are created equal, I think that's an idea that's true and that's good if understood properly and in the right context. And so there's no need to reject the idea, but we should wrestle with the way in which that idea is in sharp contrast to the lived experience of people during that time and to Jefferson's own experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what I'm suggesting is that in order to finally recognize the humanity of all of us in the current day, as Americans, I think we need to look back and recognize the humanity in all of the historical actors of the past. And I think that we haven't done that. And that's my main point. I think, for example, when we talk about history, we often talk about white history as the most important or the dominant narrative. And then there's sort of these more ancillary narratives like Native American history or African American history or even women's history. Well, African American history is American history, folks. But I think that we need, in order to recognize our humanity today, I think we need to recognize the equality and the humanity of all of the historical actors, of all of their narratives in the past, Jefferson and beyond.
Okay, good, thank you. And then could you all speak to, and maybe we start with Berkley and Devin, what have you noticed in your classrooms? Berkeley, you've been teaching for a few years.
What
So
are-
has that has the atmosphere in your classroom changed in terms of civil discussion, being able to really engage with ideas, you know, these actually really good ideas that sometimes fall away from the way it's practiced. Do you see the atmosphere in your classroom change over has it changed in step with the society?
No, well, I'm teaching journalism students mostly, so there's an openness there, just anyway, I feel like.
Well, how do you know?
How do I know?
Yes.
Because it's how I run the class. It's how the class organically works, and it's how we everyone's story connecting with these ideas is valid and important, and we have to listen with empathy, and we have to listen deeply. And so that's the first classes. We begin with that, and we go forward. I have them write an intellectual autobiography that they then they read it for 3 minutes after they've written it, and it talks about the life of their mind and how their mind has developed in concert with their own lives. Mm-hmm. And they share those stories, and we sit and listen, and I share my story. I share my story of growing up in segregated Mississippi. So I create an atmosphere of openness. I mean, things aren't that different other than the fact what's the fog that envelops us all here, 2015. And so that informs every one of my classes. I would say almost all of my classes at times. Mm-hmm. That's there and it's palpable, mm-hmm. and it's my job to be a steward to make sure those conversations, those uncomfortable conversations mm-hmm. are happening, and that they're happening, though, within the boundaries of what can be contained, mm-hmm. you know, not necessarily civil, but what can be contained and what people are able to withstand themselves.
Good, thank
and
you.
So, in certain ways, there's nothing forbidden. I mean, I go with John Milton and the other guy, Brandeis.
Okay. Devin?
I'll say this, that at times I would start a semester off, particularly when I'm teaching to the U.S. survey, with the 9/11 Commission report written by Lee Hamilton and Thomas Kane. And in that report, the major takeaway is that in part 9/11 happened because of a failure of imagination to think like those who don't think like you. And that there are material and human consequences for all of us if we fail to think like those who don't think like us. I'll just say this, I've been teaching not as long as my colleague here, but I've been teaching for a few years, and the further we move away from 9/11, I think the less resonant sort. You talk about the lived memory, right? It's more of a cultural memory now for students, but so the further we move away from 9/11, the less of a resonance it has with young people, with students, because of the memory of 9/11, those who were there or around. But again, the material consequences, the human consequences of not being able to think like those who don't think like you, and particularly those who want to, in part, do you harm. So how critical it is to think across the spectrum, and the human consequences that has. And so I think in terms of a teaching tool, that at least that has always been helpful and useful for me, particularly when I'm teaching sort of general cross-section courses. I'd say.
Good. As we think about, so I teach a class called Intro to Soul and Country Music, so I do get a divided class from day one. I notice, so I come home and I share all these stories with my family, but just this week we were listening to Nina Simone's song For Women, and there's a little piece of the verse where she talks about Black women carrying that pain that's inflicted again and again. And I had a student in the class say, like, what pain? What are you talking about? Right? So I've noticed, but that would not have been a question 5 years ago, right? But there's now a reinforced imagination that we are post-slavery, post-racism, and because it's been said at the highest levels, it's seeping into our classrooms also. And so how I teach it now is different from how I taught it then. But so that's what I'm noticing. I was wondering if you were seeing that in your classrooms too. Krista, have you noticed anything or?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's, sorry. You know, I've taught classes on Thomas Jefferson for like 10 years now. Oh, I can't really control this microphone. For like 10 years now, and when I first started teaching classes about Jefferson, I almost always had white students. And nobody wanted to talk about anything but Jefferson's political and constitutional ideas. Now I often have people of color in my classes, and not only that, but the things that they want to write about are race. For example, in my class on Jefferson this semester, we just went around the room and talked. They have midterm papers they have to write. Every single student in there is writing about Native Americans or African Americans by choice. Those are the issues that they want to engage with. This is what's important to them now. And I think that's been a big change, as you're noticing, you know, in the past few years.
And this is good,
Yes,
right?
I laud this.
Right, right. So what we need to do is figure out how to take my student who doesn't believe black women have bared the brunt, right, of certain historical facts, and take our other students who want to engage with Thomas Jefferson in real, fresh ways, and carry them all along, right? That's the challenge. So what do we do about our monuments? What do we do about our campus? Our students have been talking about taking him off the quad, and we had Annette Gordon-Reed here saying, leave him there, right? What are your thoughts? Let's start with Justin.
Nice, easy topic. I'll try to get this. I think that, particularly on our campus, everything has to be considered in context. And there's something going on in each one of these monuments that has specific things that they're communicating. And so I think that we would, as a campus, have a conversation about what's being communicated, what's being memorialized, what is our collective memory, and what do we want to honor. There's something very specific going on about the Jefferson tombstone itself, which is distinct from the actual Jefferson statue, both in terms of when the university had it, what its purpose is. I think the fact that Jefferson is writing the Declaration of Independence is itself significant. I think that the things that are on Jefferson's tombstone in terms of what he wanted to be remembered for in his life are significant. And I think that one of the dangers that we'll come into if we seek simply to remove rather than add to some of our monuments is that there's a kind of historical memory lost, rather than taking it as an opportunity or occasion to have a serious conversation about some of these hard topics. We simply don't have that conversation at all. And so what I would advocate is that we take the opportunity to think about these things, think about what we might want to add to it and remember alongside it, and also to try to take the occasion to have a serious conversation about the history surrounding the things that it does memorialize.
Very good. Thank you. Berkley, you want to?
Well, like I said, I'd like to see the
you
original
did say.
the original students, African American students, going in to the Jesse Hall the same way James Meredith is entering the Lyceum building. But and I was in that great dinner with Annette Gordon-Reed and Peter Onoff when they were asked the question by Max Little, who's a big proponent of removing the Jefferson statue. And then we had, I guess, discussions about should Sally Hemings be sitting across from him and all that. And I was meeting with Kevin McDonald yesterday, asking him some questions around this. And he said students really are interested in some other statue in conversation with Jefferson, which I did find interesting. But I like the way Ole Miss handled that Confederate monument. When you read what's on that plaque, it's clear, it's tense, and it's very uncomfortable, especially to those sons of the Confederate veterans who sued to try to get the plaque off there. So I think more speech is probably the answer. You look at South Carolina, the Capitol building where Bree Newsom was. I encourage everybody to go there and see the civil rights monuments and see where they etched out Strom Thurmond, where it said, Father of 4 children, they etched it out. Father of 5 children, and they put Essie, his first child, who was by a domestic African American, by Strom Thurmond. I mean, so I think it's a living memory, history, debate. I think you want to see the dialectic there in front of you.
I think that Berkeley should create a class that takes us all to these different monuments, because he keeps saying you should all go there. Well, you should take us there. Okay. So I want to bring back up Alexander Hefner to join the panel. You know, there might be questions that you have thought about for Mr. Hefner, or maybe the panelists have some questions for Mr. Hefner or for you all. So come on back up. So questions. Let's have a dialogue. Yes. You.
What's the virtue of attaching a person to an idea rather than simply examining the idea in the abstract and determining whether it's valid or not?
So I'm wondering if you read a story when I transitioned to become host of this program, in which I said that you should interrogate ideas, and that was really the mission of the program. But thank you for asking that. I think, I think, you know, ultimately, it is the idea, and let me thank the panelists for their contributions. It is the idea that ought to have merit, and that ought to be scrutinized and explored. You know, my contention earlier with respect to speech is that when you have an onslaught of misinformation and or hatred as the most volume concentrated, and with the influence of bots on social media, the effect of the troll is extrapolated and ultimately magnified to such an extent that it influences both our perception and the reality, which is that bots are a dominant feature. So in the social media age, we especially have to be conscious of, I think, the ulterior motives of presentations, whereas in verified news sources or textbooks or books, I think we should judge on the basis of the idea and the integrity of the idea. So to me, you know, you really can't deny that both the message and the medium are crucially important if you want to have faith in whatever it is you're consuming.
Let me interject on a point of order. I think 90 minutes is about most attention spans, and people are getting a little antsy. So let's do 1 or 2 more questions, and then we can wrap it.
Okay, there's a question right here.
So recently in class, we talked about how important it is to be like independent and objective when you're writing. So how are you able to stay objective and unbiased in your writing about a topic that you feel really strongly about?
This one for me too?
I think you're the man of the
Well,
hour.
look, you know, I host a program that is designed to illuminate, but I don't make, I don't project to the viewer or to the listener that it is not analysis driven. So the particular program that I host is formulating its editorial content largely, I think, on the basis of what is unexplored, and sometimes what's unexplored is a certain way of framing a discussion. And I would just raise this particular example of a program that I did, in which in the introduction I mentioned Roy Moore, and I said anti-constitutionalist Roy Moore. That was the first sentence was anti-constitutionalist Roy Moore. And so from that perspective, you can see that I am asserting what you might call a point of view or an analysis of a political candidate who says that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are unnecessary to his vision of the United States, which he said in other words. So to me, the framing of discourse is really an important facet of the program, and it's a lens of analysis that I think is missing in the mainstream media, and that is to say, you know, we can examine different lenses of interpretation of what is constitutionalism. And this is where I challenged students earlier today to maybe bypass or overcome overtake the paradigm now of originalists and or strict constructionists and living constitutionalists. Because if you believe the original document is original as it was most recently ratified or reconceived, then that is the original document to you. So in my program, there's a concerted effort to kind of challenge the status quo of thinking, both as I look at myself in the mirror and my guests look at themselves in the mirror.
Hi, my question is more of a proposition. You had a great idea about how to make reality TV out of other combining representatives, Democrat and Republican. Sure. As it might look like, I am an outdoor person. I'm a river guide, and more specifically, an Outward Bound instructor. And I'm not sure if anybody is familiar with Outward Bound, but you take people out on multi-day expeditions, and you have to work together as a group and get through the challenges and stuff. I've had an idea bounce around in my head for a while of why don't we get Democrats and Republicans or politicians to come out, take
Republicans and Democrats, right?
What's that? Maybe less entertaining than Naked and Afraid, although we like to keep our clothes on in Outward Bound. But have them take on the role of student and have outdoor professionals like myself take on the challenge of teaching leadership, character development, and a desire to serve to people who should be doing that already, but lack. And yeah.
Well, it's an excellent proposition, and I do, and if we can talk after, there are a couple of smaller nonprofits that have formed in recent years to take that approach, and there are examples of folks on the Hill who've taken that initiative. For instance, their neighboring congressman in Texas who did a road trip to D.C. and taped many of their conversations in the car as they stopped Will Hurd and Beto O'Rourke. Beto O'Rourke is now the Senate candidate in Texas. So there are definitely folks who've, I think, demonstrated that leadership capacity. There hasn't been adequate investment by, I think, news executives and journalists to view their product, their service, as something that can be constructive. And I just want to add one note with respect to civility. You know, I think of civil discourse today as including civil disobedience. And I think that we have to expand that definition and rewrite. If we want to rewrite what constitutionalism means today, or invent it for the present age, we have to similarly, I think, define our idea of civil discourse, which includes, I think, dialogue, disobedience, and a whole host of modes of learning, exchange, protest. And so from that perspective, I hope that civil discourse is something that can be jointly operationalized with an inclusive nationalism. And there was a book I was recommending to your students earlier today by Yasha Monk, Democracy versus the People. And I think that that book in particular is an example of how we can strive for a culture of civility that does value an inclusive and embrace an inclusive nationalism. So I'd urge you to take a look at that new book.
So I know Justin has given me the eye, the blue eye.
The green.
If we could just get the questions, and we may not have time for the answer, but there are 3 people who have had their hands up for forever. So could we please, Justin?
Sure, absolutely. And everyone, please feel free to stick around and engage with the panelists and with Alexander and continue the conversation.
These ladies here first. So real quick, keep it short.
Hi. I really think that this whole discussion was fascinating and very eye-opening. My question is, how can we as students, how can we as a community, how can we as citizens kind of tie all these different themes and actually make actions rather than, I believe talking about it is great and everything, but I do believe that there are times when we do need to take action. And what would you suggest, such as organizations or even just things in the community or even in the whole country? What can we do?
besides rafting and so on. Let's get him. Can you just shout it out real quick? And then we'll take some answers.
Yeah, one of my main question is regarding, having more monuments or keeping monuments in place. And I know one of the main criticisms of that, keeping the monuments, is that it's not in a, it's not in a traditionally educational context. So how in a society where, as we've seen on social media, we're so quick to make knee-jerk reactions, do we have that educational discussion outside of a traditionally educational context like a museum?
Okay, so those two, I think, are questions about next steps.
Yeah.
So,
And then is there
Justin,
is that a third?
is this for extra credit also?
And we
Questions
could,
for
we could
extra
tackle.
credit. Will you get extra credit if you go up afterwards and talk to them?
That's the culprit. Well, let's try to tackle these last two.
Yes, please.
I'll give one. One question was, what do we do? Next steps. And I just have a very modest answer to that. I think that we all have some bigger spheres of influence than others, but in the limited sphere of influence that we have, I think we can take some practical steps. And a lot of that has to do with the people around you. And one of the things that we're trying to do on campus is get together with other people to have these discussions, to get together with students to have those discussions. And I know some people will take it to a larger scale, but that's not a small thing. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to continue that work and to have at least a limited impact in our area of the world.
I just want to add the idea that Brian Stevenson brought to us when he came to speak on campus, which is the same thing. It's you get proximate with people who on the surface do not seem to look like you, think like you, live like you, but you've got to find a way to get proximate and get to know them and to know their stories and to share your own story.
Maybe monuments in the educational context.
Okay, I can tackle the monuments question here. So I think actually it starts with maybe something that you've done, Berkley, or I know I do in my classes, that in order to get people to be aware of the historical memory in the landscape, the disparity between memory and history, we need to start getting out of the classroom and taking our students into that environment. So actually every one of my classes starts at the Jefferson Memorial. We engage with it. We engage with what it says and what it doesn't say, what's comfortable and what's uncomfortable. What's the context for this monument? What other monuments would you put up if you could? And I think starting with monuments, engaging with students in conversations about those monuments is a key departure point for us as teachers. And I think that can be replicated by other public educators, museum educators, students elsewhere. But I think the conversation has to start somewhere. But I think in order to have that conversation, we have to have signposts of our past. And those aren't just the comfortable, mythic signposts. Those are the really uncomfortable signposts that talk about our past, our genocide, history of slavery and Jim Crow, and other exclusivity and oppression.
So as we wrap up, please watch The Open Mind on PBS, another wonderful institution that is in danger. If PBS or NPR is gone, we are left with these network cable shows. That's dangerous. Let's, Berkley.
Just 30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay.
So you can go see James Scott's tombstone in the Columbia Cemetery.
Yeah.
He was lynched in Columbia, Missouri.
Yes.
You can go and see the lynching memorial at the intersection of Stewart Road and Providence.
Okay,
Those
and
are
you
two
should
things
start
you
that
can go.
class of yours right there and then take us everywhere else. So thank you, Mr. Hefner, and thank you, the panelists.